So welcome everybody to the Wolfpack Wellness Research web series. I am your host, Dr. Susie Goodell. This series is a collaboration between the University Wellness Advisory Committee, the NC State Libraries, and NC State Wellness and Recreation. We aim to discuss the wellness research happening across NC State's campus. For those of you joining us live via Zoom, you can submit your questions to our speaker in the chat function, and we'll have a Q&A time at the end of the show. So today's guest is Dr. Jonathan Casper. He is an associate professor and sports management program coordinator in the Department of Parks, Rec, and Tourism Management in the College of Natural Resources here at NC State. His research focuses on healthy, happy people and the natural environment. He has one research line related to sports and environmental sustainability, and the other on sports psychology and marketing. Dr. Casper is an internationally recognized researcher on sports and the natural environment. His research seeks to help support organizations integrate sustainability efforts into organizational operations, marketing, and fan engagement. He's worked extensively, I'm having a problem talking today, extensively with collegiate athletic departments, professional sports teams, and corporate sponsors on implementation and evaluation strategic sustainability efforts. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Casper.
No problem. Thank you. That's a lot. Yeah.
It's a lot, but that's awesome. We're very excited to have you today. And the first thing, I gave a little bit of an introduction, but you know you better than anyone else probably. So could you give us a little intro to you and your research lab and what's going on there?
Sure. I'll try and be brief, but I have been at NC State now for 17 years. It has gone by fast, believe it or not. I was first hired when we had our sport management program approved. And so when I first got here, was one of the few faculty members to teach many of the courses that are offered now for our sport management students, and then also start doing some research related to sport management as well. And so it's been a quick 17 years to say the least. And as mentioned, I do, from a research perspective, have kind of two horns of research. Sometimes they relate a lot together, sometimes they don't, but I like to keep them going as much as possible. Today, I'll focus mostly on sport and sustainability, but I do have a passion for sport participation, especially, and looking at sport over a lifetime. So that's another interest of mine. So maybe I can come back and talk about that.
Absolutely, that's a great idea. So, writing that down in my brain right now.
I'd be happy to.
Awesome.
As far as what I do here at NC State, as far as teaching, I'm kind of the marketing guy within our department. So I teach sport marketing in the other undergraduate curriculum. I also teach it in our professional master's program. And then we also have a sport and entertainment venue management certificate program where I have a marketing course that I teach there as well. So marketing is my niche here within our college. So I'll probably stop there because I go on longer.
No, I'm going to be asking you all about you and your research. So anytime you want to share details, we're happy to hear them.
Sounds good.
So you did say that you're going to be talking about sports and sustainability efforts today. So tell me your main research goal or objective that you've been focusing on lately, and what spurred this as a need for you.
Okay, well, I guess the history with the research that I've been doing on sport and sustainability goes back to about 2009, 2008, or 2009. And when I was at a sport management conference, our national conference called NASM, the keynote speaker started talking about some important and emerging issues within sport and brought up environmental sustainability as one of those issues. And on the bus back to the hotel, I was like, wow, this is actually something that really kind of sparked my interest. I grew up in Colorado where environmental sustainability was valued. I went to an undergraduate college called Pitzer College, which is in California, and sustainability was a big part of our curriculum and our education there. And then my sister also is general counsel for Greenpeace. So I have a sister, I have a sister who also is very vested in the natural environment. So with that, I was like, wow, I need to maybe think of ways to incorporate this within my research. And so with that, I started looking at what was going on from a sustainability perspective related to colleges and college sports in general. And so what kind of spurred me on to that was within NC State, we have a sustainability office, and I see Lanny here as well, who's on this as well. And they are experts when it comes to environmental sustainability. And then we have the athletic department, who has a large environmental footprint, and looking at how they work together and what's going on and what are some of the priorities for athletic departments overall. So the first study that I ever did related to sport and sustainability was basically at a higher level, upper administrative level within athletic administration, looking at what were their priorities when it came to sustainability, how are decisions being made, what are some environmental initiatives that are happening? How is this communication process going? So it was a pretty extensive survey that we had that kind of started my interest and momentum when it came to sustainability. And so what came of that, at least in that first study that I did, is I found some interesting findings. First of all, that from a top-down perspective, athletic director all the way down to all the people that work in administration, the importance of sustainability and what's happening within sustainability can be very mixed. So there's some where it was a top strategic priority, and some it never was even on the map, like never even thought about it. Another thing, and this is what led to a lot of the momentum that we have here at NC State with sustainability, is that there was a disconnect between sustainability offices or departments, however they are within the university, and the communication that happens within athletics. And so that spurred me to contact our sustainability office at the time. Tracy Dixon was the sustainability head of sustainability at the time. And I said, hey, do you guys ever work with the athletic department? And they're like, no, but we'd love to. And so with that started kind of a working group that still exists to this day, where sustainability has taken the lead in trying to work more with the athletic department. And so that was a kind of I think a win in many ways. We had a lot of momentum before, and Lanny, who's here, can speak to our recycling program within football, and then now was turned into even a bigger effort as well. But that was what originally kind of got me going within kind of sports and sustainability.
So clearly, when we talk about your work, we're talking about sports and sustainability. One term that I think you said many, many times that we haven't actually defined for some of our viewers is the word sustainability. What does that mean in terms of when looking at program success, and what are the outcomes you're looking for?
Well, sustainability is hard to define, and you can look at it in a variety of ways. And so when you look at like the buckets of sustainability, I focus a lot on the environmental aspects of sustainability, while it overlaps with social and economic as well, as far as that goes. What I try and think when I think about sustainability and how it relates to some of the research I do is, how can the environment be accounted for when it comes to organizational actions within, and for example, within a sport organization or an athletics department, if we're talking about college, and how is it not only accounted for, but how is it addressed, and how can it also be enhanced in certain ways? And so looking at how can the fact that we look at this bucket of sustainability being environment, how can we feature it, and how can we use it to promote overall good, especially when it comes to thinking about protection of our natural resources and environment.
So when looking at, we were talking mostly about your connections with NC State athletics.
Mhm.
When looking at that 14-year period from when it's 13, 14 years.
Yeah,
Right?
it's been a while.
Incredible, right?
Mhm.
So when looking at that, how have things changed from there's this mixed bag, people thinking about it or not thinking about it, not even knowing really that it's a thing to think about,
Mhm.
all the way to now? What does that trajectory look like?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to answer this a couple of ways, and hopefully I'll get to it. But the easy answer is that the momentum related to environmental sustainability has continued to grow each year that I've been somewhat involved with it. And so what started with just kind of these ideas or making sure that we account for sustainability was nothing novel 14 years ago, but there wasn't a coordinated movement really specific to environmental sustainability in sport. And the basic premise behind this, first of all, how does sport relate to environmental sustainability, goes beyond just the context of hosting sporting events or having a sport facility and accommodating kind of the environmental footprint that comes from that. The big part that relates to sport, and probably what most will argue is the most important part, is that sport is a platform for change for a variety of different realms. And so with that, the momentum started that, hey, here are sports. They have these loyal fans that identify with sport programs or sport teams. For example, if you saw my office, you'd see a whole bunch of Denver Bronco gear around.
I'm
That's
sorry.
because I identify, and last Monday was a tough one for me, but I identify as a Bronco fan, and it's incorporated in my life. And because of that, the Denver Broncos, or in this case, you're here at NC State athletics, or the Wolfpack, becomes an important part of not only culture, but of personal identity. And so with that, we see that's where the power of sport comes into play when it comes to sustainability. So now I'll get to this growing momentum and how that's kind of turned into even a bigger monster in many ways. So with that, we started to see some organizations start to embrace sustainability and organize around sustainability. Probably one of the best examples early on, and it started out in the Northwest, was a organization called the Green Sport Alliance. And so initially these were sports that were mostly, it was Portland, Seattle, some sports that got together and started talking about coordinating sustainability efforts. And that's turned into a major organization. And if you just Google Green Sport Alliance, you can kind of see what they do. So there started to be, at a professional level mostly, a coordination and organization related to environmental sustainability and sport. That has since become even more and more momentum. Now there's international organizations. For example, in 2 weeks, I'll be flying out to London to go to something called the Sport Positive Summit, which is a summit that is basically sponsored, and a lot of the momentum came from the United Nations. And so there's part of the United Nations and part of what they're doing, and the International Olympic Committee. So you're seeing these big sport organizations starting to incorporate sustainability from all different aspects into what they do, and looking at their social and cultural influence as well. So that's where this momentum's come from. But from a researcher perspective, me being a dorky professor here sitting in my office doing research and trying to figure out how does this all matter and why does it matter, the momentum's really gone a long way. And so it used to be maybe me and 3 or 4 other professors that even had anything to do with sport and sustainability, to now an organized effort within that. And so I was lucky to be a founding member of something called the Sport Ecology Group, which is a large coordinated group of academics, and we're getting bigger and bigger each year, that focus mostly on the academic side of sport and sustainability. And there's a variety of different ways that it's studied. It's studied looking at, for example, in my case, I focus mostly on fan engagement, on how fans can be engaged within sustainability. But there's also things related to climate change and looking at policy level decisions that are happening. There's facility and administrative functions that go along with it. So now, instead of just being 1 or 2 professors that are focusing on this, I'd say there's probably 30 or 40 that at least I know of that are doing that. And within that organization that I mentioned initially, NASA, where I first thought of this. So it's actually becoming a category within the conference. So there's sport marketing, there's sport finance, there's sport administration, and now there's actually going to be a whole a sport ecology that's part of it as well. So it's nice to kind of see it growing, not only from a professional and practitioner perspective, but also from an academic faculty perspective.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm going to kind of dive into the weeds here. When we talk about how fans can be a part of the sustainability effort and how sports and fans and all these things collide, can you tell me about some of the efforts that you've looked at NC State? What are some efforts that maybe have been successful, and are there things that haven't been successful based on the research you've done?
Yeah, so most of the research that I just mentioned is kind of looking at fans and how receptive they are to environmental sustainability efforts. So we have a variety of different environmental sustainability efforts that happen here at NC State, for example. So Zero Waste Wolfpack is probably our best example of what we do. And that has grown from what was called Chuck It Wagon, or it was basically when we had Coach Chuck Amato, it was basically a wagon that went through tailgating lots where you could throw recycling in, into an effort now where where sustainability office and waste management work together to manage an amazing effort that's at Carter Finley, an award-winning, actually amazing effort at Carter Finley, where not only are they accounting for recycling that happens in the tailgating lots, which God bless them, is a tough effort, but also within the stadium where we have composting available, we have zero waste stations, we have education on it. Next Tuesday, or the next football game that we have against UConn, sustainability is part of the promotional themes that happen. So there'll be educational videos about sustainability, hopefully some activities for fans to do. But my research is focused on that. And not only do these initiatives change how make people more aware of environmental sustainability and how their behaviors can contribute to becoming more pro-environmental, both at games, but also at home. But also looking at how receptive they are to some of the other things that are important from an athletic perspective, if a sponsor is part of it. So for example, Waste Industries or Aquafina or all these other organizations that kind of make it happen from an initiatives perspective, how much are fans receptive to that? And so I focus mostly on the decision-making process. I look at how the efforts that are done within sport add to the value of game day experiences and how much it meets the expectations of fan bases. Excuse me. So that's that's kind of what I look at in a big umbrella type of perspective. And I can give you just a little bit more on what I have found if you're interested.
Yes, please.
And that is that most of the efforts are, first of all, welcomed. If we, for example, with Wolfpack fans, we found that 68% of NC State fans are receptive and want environmental initiatives at the game. So that's something that's good. We're meeting their needs when we're doing something like that. We found that the initiatives help with awareness, knowledge, and also intention for behaviors. So if we look, for example, at sustainable transportation, or we look at composting, or some of these real specific environmental initiatives, most of my research has found that by having these things at the sporting events raises their awareness, and also creates a social norm, which we found is really important. So if you see other people composting, you feel like it's important that I need to do that as well, because if I'm not doing it, then I'm actually doing something different than the rest. So we see that social norming is important. And while it's very hard to measure behavior, especially behavior that changes at home, we've seen that intentions to do that have been pretty favorable. So that I think is really important. Another, what I think is really important part of some of the research that we've done is that environmental sustainability, whether we like it or not, can often be politicized. It can often be something where there's a group of people that are very receptive, and then a group of people that are not, right? And so having the platform of sport sometimes provides that neutral platform for that. And so we have an initial study that we finished. It was right before COVID, right before COVID, where we kind of looked at political affiliation, so Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and looked at some of the initiatives that were happening, and used a variety of different scales to understand receptivity, identification, being able to name the sponsors. And we found that actually those that identified as Republican or conservative were actually just as aware of these initiatives and were able to, and just as educated about them as independents and Democrats. So it shows that it can be an area to make something that often is politicized into something that's just common sense, good behavior, and to take care of our world and our natural environment.
So, I mean, so many questions
There's
here.
so many, so much stuff.
But I want to ask one more question before we get to the Q&A time. So y'all who are on live, if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box so we can get to them. But you mentioned sponsorships and affiliations. How do people, I mean, I guess I kind of get waste management, right? Like that's what they do. But how do other organizations get involved in this kind of work? I know that kind of may go into the marketing schemes of things. And how is it decided that these are the people who should be involved? And I also would like to see, because you said that people can recognize the different sponsors. How does sponsorship really like impact individuals' views of the sponsors, if you have measured that at all?
Okay. Well, first of all, sport and sustainability has created almost a new category for sponsors. And so those organizations that ordinarily may not sponsor sport or the sport platform are sponsoring because of some of the environmental initiatives that happen. BASF is a good example. I've done some consulting work with the University of Colorado, and that's a chemical company, and they have a policy of not sponsoring sport, but yet they do because they're actually sponsoring an environmental program that the University of Colorado has. So that's it. It's interesting because the athletics departments are the ones that are responsible for getting the sponsors, or they hire it out. So like Learfield is the one that does NC State. So they are able to now ask organizations maybe that ordinarily wouldn't ask because it's a sport, but because they're doing something that's related to sustainability can be an avenue for that. Most of the time when we look at like how does fans respond to some of these things, it usually there has to be a natural fit. So for example, with Pepsi, it's about recycling aluminum cans, but also their plastic bottles. BASF, they make composting bags. They make corn-based composting bags. So hooking them up to a composting type of initiative makes sense. So there still needs to be a natural fit for how that goes. But what we do see is that from a sponsor perspective, I don't want to get too businessy in this, but it is just like sport is for other companies, it can be a very valuable resource for gaining awareness and gaining an identity within a certain fan base.
Thanks. So I don't have any comments in the chat box, y'all. So I can keep on asking questions, but if anything comes up, y'all let me know. So one other thing that I'd love to know is the coolest or most interesting thing you think about when you want to talk about your research that we haven't discussed yet. Is there something within this field that you're like, wow, this is super amazing?
Okay. Well, boy, I don't know if there's things that are super amazing.
You can go with just amazing.
Well, I think the politics or non-political thing I think is important. I think that we can learn to make environmental sustainability fun using sport, which is actually something that's really interesting. By having fun initiatives, for example, some kind of contest or something that the fans can interact with in a different way, I think is really unique. So for example, and there are some examples, but I know one example. This is I think it was in Mexico, or they basically had a problem with all their fans just basically throwing their cigarette butts in the stadium and just leaving them there. So they had a special contest where they had cans specifically for cigarette butts, where they could vote who their biggest rival was or what player they hated the most. And they found that the stadium itself was completely empty of cigarette butts because everybody was wanting to vote on who their enemy, their rival was, or the enemy player that they have. So I think making it fun is really important. And I think there's some really unique things that you can do looking at environmental sustainability. I mean, there's so many categories of environmental sustainability. So there's air pollution, which I didn't even talk about, but Dr. Buns, who's a professor here, and I did a real fun study where we had this $50,000 backpack that was an artificial lung, and we walked through all the tailgating lots and through the stadium and looked to identify where there was, bad air pollution versus not bad air pollution. We had monitors on the light structures that were constantly monitoring air pollution. So there's some innovative things that you can do. I'll quickly tell you the results of that if you're interested. To stay away from charcoal grills and stay away from idling vehicles. And also, when you exit Carter Finley, close your windows and be inhaling that air, because it's somewhere between 5 to 10 times higher than any level is acceptable, because everybody turns on their cars, and boom, it becomes a pollution cloud. So hopefully you have good ventilation inside your car for some of that. But I think thinking of still innovative ways to look at sustainability within sport can be neat, because sport is such a unique product.
Okay, we have 2 questions, and I'm going to get the one that just came off mute. Linnell?
So I just love this because I am an advisor over exploratory studies. And a lot of our students are like, I like sports. I want to go in business. I'll do sport management. But you're bringing up a conversation I have never put the two together before. So I think this is great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it is. And as the sport management coordinator here, that's probably one of our biggest the biggest issues is when we have new students. They're like, I love sports, I love ESPN, right, or something like that, but don't know really the logistics of sport and what makes sport happen, and all of the aspects that relate to making a sporting event happen, and the administration of running a sport. So yeah, this is one that we don't really think about, but within our coursework, we have Dr. Buns, who I just mentioned, has a sustainable facilities course that we teach our sport management students. So we're trying to incorporate it more and more within our curriculum.
Thank you. That was a great comment. I appreciate that. And then we have one that says, what is the future of your research? What's next?
Good question. I think perceptions of climate change and how people act and view climate change is really important. And I think this is where going beyond just the individual behaviors that help with climate change, whether it's sustainable transportation and all that, just looking at people's attitudes about climate change overall. We see a lot of news. For example, I watch WRAL a lot, and it seems like every time that there's something about climate change or something like that. Well, how can sport also be something that provides more awareness about that? So I think looking at climate change and climate change attitudes through sport, again, is a way where it's less politicized, and can be one where we start to look at, okay, wolves, we're the Wolfpack, right? How is the wolf climate being affected by climate change, right? So using things like that, where you never would ordinarily think about it, how can that be done? Also, looking at climate change as a social justice issue, I think, is really important, because climate change is disproportionately affecting lower income communities and people of color. And so understanding how that can be done, and how we within sports can be part of promoting and changing, or at least letting people know how they can help in some way about some of those. So those are probably the two things right there.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I am going to put another little for next time on this issue. I'd love to know how athletes are impacted by all of this, these marketing efforts and things like that. But I know we don't have time for that today.
Sounds good.
But I'm going to take you up on that offer, and I'll be sending you an email soon about coming back and talking more.
Happy to be back.
So that is the conclusion for our day. Wow, I am really having problems today. That is the conclusion of our show today. And I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Casper for speaking to us about sports and sustainability. And thank you all for watching. As a reminder, our broadcast is every third Friday of the month at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And next month's show is also going to be something interesting that applies to everyone, that Dr. Robert Clark from the Poole College of Management is going to be talking about financial literacy. You can find more information about the Wolfpack Wellness Research web series and our previous show recordings at Wolfpack Wellness website. And I am your host, Susie Goodell. Until next time, be well.